I'd like you to imagine that our boss walks up to us and says, "Congratulations, you are now in charge collectively, you and I are now in charge of operations security for the network. And your goal," says the boss, "is I want you to safeguard the information system assets that we currently have in place." But our boss also says, "Have no fear, we have some controls in place that have been set up and tested." And so part of operations security is to make sure that those controls remain in place and that any changes that we do in the future or changes that happen to the network don't compromise CIA. Because as we know, every asset in our company, those assets have potential vulnerabilities. And hopefully the controls that we put in place can help mitigate or protect against those vulnerabilities being exposed. So for example, if we have an asset and that asset has a vulnerability, the controls in place and the preventive mechanisms hopefully are putting a barrier between that asset and its vulnerability and the potential threat. And without any controls in place, the vulnerabilities are exposed and the potential for loss is great. And we want to avoid that. So as part of operations, some of our responsibilities are going to be to back up the systems. So recovery would also be a responsibility of operations. Making sure audit trails happen would be part of our responsibility. The operational procedures that need to be followed, specifically detail by detail, what has to happen. Things like BC, which stands for business continuity, which also goes back to backup and recovery. If something bad or terrible happens, how quickly can we get that business up and running or maintain business in the event of a system or partial system failure? So that would also involve contingency planning. As part of our operations, we might implement an IDS, intrusion detection system. And if we're going to put one in, we also might want to monitor alerts as well. So we're monitoring the network, looking for any type of alerts or issues that come up that might affect performance of that system. As part of operations and maintaining our controls, we want to be in charge of change control regarding everything on the system, regarding hardware changes, software changes, version control. For example, we may have a system that uses lots of subcomponents that are all interrelated. And let's say we're just going to update this one portion. We'd want to make sure we're restricting access to any individual component, and if that component is going to be upgraded, we'd want to make sure we have the entire procedure for change control so it's documented, who's going to do it, what's going to happen, has it been tested, has it been signed off by management, and is there a rollback procedure in case it goes poorly. All that change control detail needs to be part of operations. There are lots of different mechanisms that we can use for controls, and I've created this table for us to help put those in perspective. This column right here represents the types of controls: physical controls, administrative, and technical controls. An example of physical controls would be things like fences, a physical security guard, a locked door, a physically secured wiring closet or data center. Those are all physical in nature. When we see the concept of administrative controls, that type, we're referring to dealing with people, a background check before an individual is given a clearance level. And the technical controls are the software or the hardware components such as firewalls, encryption, intrusion detection, authentication mechanisms. So from the perspective of a security administrator, most of their work is going to be with technical controls. Now, in addition to these types of controls over here, we also have the functionality of controls. And they're pretty straightforward. The preventive control is trying to avoid the occurrence of the incident. A preventative physical control would be a card reader that you have to use before you can get physical entry into a building. A preventive administrative control would be something like the hiring practices at the company, the pre-employment background check, security awareness training, the policies and procedures that should be followed. Those are all administrative. And an example of technical preventive controls would be things like passwords, multi-factor or two-factor authentication, encryption, antivirus software, access control lists on firewalls, intrusion detection and prevention systems. The next step I'd love for you to take is to identify what is the functionality of that control. Now let's take the word auditing as an example. And auditing is a fun one because it actually fits in multiple areas. The process of collecting the audit trail is a technical control. So auditing could be a technical control as far as actually doing the collection of that data. But we could also have an administrative control that says in a policy that we are going to go ahead and review the audit files from time to time or periodically, whatever the policy says. And that policy regarding auditing would be an administrative control. And so the next question is, what is the functionality of those logs? Well, from a technical perspective, once we collect that audit information and we review it, the main purpose is detective in nature. And it's very likely from an administrative perspective, that's why we have it as well. Good old Bob, he logs into a database, he makes some changes. So going back to our audit trail, we can identify the behavior of what happened between Bob and that object, and the use or data flow involved. And if there is an issue or a problem, that audit log is now being used as a detective control. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.